Thank you all. You're all very kind. I am, among my various other tasks, the curator of the Rare Map Collection, which is an absolutely incredible privilege. It is a huge blessing to be able to be responsible for such an incredible collection. And before I get into my talk, I want to take a few moments to tell you a little bit about our Rare Map Collection. Our Rare Map Collection contains around 1,250 maps, give or take a map or two, and it specializes in maps of the North Pacific prior to 1920, as well as maps of Antarctica. Now, it's not the only map collection in the library. We also have an extensive, more current map, non-circulating map collection as part of our main Alaska collections. And we have a manuscript map collection as part of our archives. And those are maps that are handwritten or heavily hand annotated. So somebody's gone in there and drawn a bunch of stuff. When I think about the map collection, it is an incredible responsibility and privilege to be a part of it because it has an amazing history. Marvin Falk really helped build that collection, and I think it's really important to acknowledge the incredibly hard work that was put into it under both him and the most recent curator, Kathy Arndt. And we would not have a map collection at all, really, were it not for the incredible generosity of Elmer E. Rasmuson himself, who not only purchased many maps for us, donated many maps to us, but left us an endowment which has allowed us to continue to grow the map collection. So I know that's a lot of thank yous, but I always like to acknowledge all of those things before we spend some time looking at a whole bunch of maps. I want to start our talk with a poll. I'm doing a quick poll. My question for everyone in the room is, how many of you recognize location A? Right? Everybody stands up? Everybody knows what that is? Right? That's all right, recognize that. I mean, it's simplified, right? It's missing the Perbolofs, there's no St. Lawrence Island, the Aleutian chain is a little short. But we look at that and we're like, yeah, we know what that is. Okay, how many of us recognize location B? No. Okay, well, my husband does because he's seen this talk a few times, so we'll count him out, right? Most of us don't know that. But location B is, in fact, Alaska, as depicted on a 1773 map. And what we're going to talk about today is how we get from that to this, right? How do we get from B to A? And what are all the strange predecessors that exist before we get to A? In short, how did the Europeans imagine Alaska? And for what purpose did their imaginings serve? Before we do that, we're going to lay a little bit of a scaffold groundwork, right? We are going to start with, what is a map anyway? Right? And I think it's important that we define a map, because most of us think we know what a map is. But if you ask someone to define a map, it's sort of like, well, I'm not sure. Harley and Woodward, in their book, The History of Cartography, have a good definition. A map is a graphic representation that facilitates spatial understanding of things, concepts, conditions, processes, or events in the human world. Another way to think about a map is a graphic representation of geographic space, right? That's what this thing is. And we have one here from the Alaska Climate Center, so 2026. Not a map in our rare collection. But I think it's a really good example of a simplified modern map. Right? One of the things about maps is that maps are always asserting something. Because maps are forms of communication, they are cultural texts, and they encode meaning, power, perspective. Mark Mortimer, in his book, How to Lie with Maps, stressed that maps are representational. And that means that they generalize, and they omit, and they are symbolic, right? Rather than literally meaningful in many ways. So we think about this map of Alaska, indigenous peoples and peoples and languages, those lines are awfully straight, right? And people are awfully mobile, right? So if we stop and think about it, this has got to be a simplified representation. That doesn't mean it's a bad representation or a wrong representation or that it's doing anything wrong. It simply is that maps inevitably assert something, and therefore we can read them. Not just for what they literally say, but for what they symbolically mean. And then the question is, how do we go about doing that, right? If we're going to be reading these things beyond their geographic purpose, how do they functionally operate? So when I teach primary source literacy to students, I will often say, and if you've ever had to take a class with me, you will have heard this, context is king. By which I mean, in order to understand any object, regardless of its relationships, we have to think about when and why and how it was made, right? So we can do that by asking ourselves 4 really basic questions. And you can ask these questions of any historical document. In this talk, we're going to be asking them of maps, but I really want to emphasize these aren't map specific. Where and when was this thing made, right? Who was it made for? And an expansion of that really is who was it made by? But what's the intended audience, right? The intended audience of that indigenous language map is me. I use it all the time in my classes. It's really helpful. And for my students, it needs to be pretty straightforward, right? A lot of them have never thought about this before. It's a good thing it's designed the way it's designed, right? We also want to think about whose voice is missing. Who is not communicating in this map? And also, what is missing? Omission is absolutely as important as inclusion, and it can tell us a lot about a document. And lastly, what is it trying to communicate to the viewer, right? Maps are acts of communication. They're trying to communicate something to the person looking at them. What is that something, and how do we go about understanding it? And with all of that done, we are going to now talk about the legendary Rupas Nigra. We're not going to start with Alaska today. We're going to get bigger. We're going to start with the North Pole. All right, so the Rupas Nigra, which is on this map, which I will pass around so any people can look at it. This is a print. We have these teaching prints, and so I grabbed some of them that related to this talk. I sadly was not able to put all of my maps on paper for you. So, we must go back in time now to a world where people in Europe really didn't know what was at the North Pole. And so what they did, what everyone does when they want to figure out what is somewhere they've never been. They looked for writings of people who had been there. One of the people who was looking for these writings was Gernardus Mercator. This is the first time today you are going to get to listen to me pretend to pronounce a name. There is about a 50-50 split if I'm ever going to do so correctly. I'm extremely dyslexic. I apologize. So, Mercator. Mercator of the Mercator projection, right? Which if you're at a map talk, I assume you're pretty familiar with, right? So Mercator creates maps, right? That's what he does. That's his business. And he creates globes, especially. He's famous for his globes. And so he has to put a North Pole on his globes. So he's looking for resources, right? And he comes across this book called The Imperium by Jacobus Cohen. And in this book, Cohen cites a medieval manuscript that was written by a Franciscan friar from Oxford who claims that he has gone to the North Pole above Scandinavia. And in the North Pole, he has found these 4 islands, right? And in the middle of these 4 islands, there is a giant mountain called the Rupas Nigra. And this mountain is a mountain of solid iron. So it is extremely magnetic. And this is why, ladies and gentlemen, this is why compasses point north. Now, I know that this sounds ridiculous to all of us sitting in this room, because we understand that that is not, in fact, why compasses point north. But in 1500, this was as reasonable of a theory as any theory anyone had. What I love about this story above, really, well, there's two things I love about it. One is that all of the books that Mercator is citing, no one can find them. No one has seen that medieval manuscript in 500 years, and no one can find the book that he claims that cites it. So we really don't know if he's actually just making all of this up. What we do know about these maps is that it sticks around for a long time. And what you can see in this one from 1613 is these rivers. So there are these 4 channels that go between, and those are like the 4 rivers of Eden. Right? So the medieval cosmology was very tied to a literal belief of the descriptions of the world that appeared in the Bible. And so it made sense to people that in the North Pole there would be these 4 rivers. Right? This was logical. One of the eventual things that Mercator does is he publishes all of his maps in a single book and calls it an atlas. And that is from where we get the word atlas, right? So he names it after the Greek god who holds up the earth. And this book is wildly popular. This is a New York Times bestseller of its day, right? This thing goes into multiple reprints. It circles all around. And so this northern Arctic map of these 4 islands just becomes the common understood way the world operates. And one of the things I want you to notice on this map, and I think I have a pointer here. I do. Okay. Is this little passageway there, which breaks up Europe and North America, right? Pay attention to that. We're going to come back to that later. So that's important. All right. This one is earlier. This one is 1540. And one of the things you might notice is this doesn't have that same break on it, right? We have Europe here. There's Europe. And we have Greenland there. And we just have one solid line of Earth, right? Okay. So what's happening there? To understand what's going on in these maps where there is no division between North America and Asia, we have to go back to Ptolemy the Elder. We have to go back to ancient Greece, where we run into Ptolemy, who lived in Egypt, and who wrote a book describing the geography of the world as he understood it, which is all very well and good. It got rediscovered in the Renaissance, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, here's the important thing to know. He miscalculated the circumference of the Earth by give or take 20%. Some people say 17%, some people say 23%. Not my area of expertise, but it's too small. So it doesn't allow for a Pacific Ocean. It doesn't fit. Based on the measurements of things they knew at the time. But of course, this falls apart in about 1520, when Magellan sails around the tip of South America, has what I think we can all agree is the world's worst voyage. He doesn't even live through it. It's a rough going for Magellan. He gets around the tip, and he suddenly finds, oh, there's this water over here. And he misestimates the size of the Pacific Ocean because he doesn't think it should be there, and then proceeds to almost starve to death trying to get to the Philippines. Is it? In defense of the man, he didn't know. So once they realize, oh yeah, there's a Pacific Ocean, then there can be a strait. And this mythical strait needs a name. And so they name it the Strait of Annan. So the Strait of Annan, well, that's way off where it's supposed to be. I don't know what happened to my PowerPoint. That little drawing was supposed to be right over here. It sort of points in the right direction, I suppose. So that is the Strait of Annan, right there in the corner. So the Strait of Annan is critical to the Europeans. They have to have the Strait of Annan, because if they have the Strait of Annan, then they can have the Northwest Passage. If there is a way to get between North America and Asia, then you can bring a ship over the top of Canada. So the Strait of Annan is critical to their ability to justify looking for the Northwest Passage. They really, really want it to be there. The name probably comes from the writing of Marco Polo. Nobody's 100% sure how we come up with the Strait of Annan. This is what we end up with. And the Strait of Annan shows up real fast, right? Word of Magellan's voyages spreads, and pretty soon people are like, okay, we think there's water there, now we got to figure out how to justify it. So as you can see on this 1578 map, and that's an estimated date, we're not 100% sure, you can see there we have the Strait of Annan right there with that lovely sea monster above it and that interesting ship coming out of it, which I think is quite a lot of fun. Oh, I'm a sucker for a good-looking sea monster. They disappear around 1700 on maps, and it just makes me very sad on a very deep level. I really miss them, you know? I like my sea monsters. One of the really interesting things about this map is how empty America is. So this is North America, and you can see how crowded Asia is. And I think this is really good evidence of how much documentation Europeans had of what was going on in China and how little they knew about what was going on in North America, right? In fact, they even specifically call this Peru, right? So they know from the Spaniards that these things are over here, but they don't have a solid understanding of what they're looking at. And these maps continue, and they're quite popular. One of the elements of mapping I want to mention, and interestingly enough, very few of the maps I'm showing you today have a good example of this, but this one does, is a cartouche. So in the world of maps, the cartouche is this big decorative circle right here, this big thing that's kind of encircling here. And that's another one down there. And these are very common. And this is where people would put, hey, look, this is what a map is of, right? And they would just decoratively wrap it around in a circle. Somebody asked me why once, and I was like, I don't know, it was the thing. It's still a thing. It's just what people do. They've gotten less fun over the years. Now they're usually boring squares. You know, we could be a little more exciting, I think. But back in the day, they really decorate them up. And so this is just another example of that Strait of Annan. We have another lovely boat. We have a very weirdly fat Japan. I don't know what's going on with Japan there. And then we have this, again, this extremely empty North America. And this is another personal favorite. This is from 1652, and I have a printout of this one. I will start this one on this side, since the other side got to start the other one. So the original of this map has beautiful gold leaf all over it, which you really can't see in this photo, tragically. One of the neat things about this map is it has the poles inset on it. So you can see here's the North Pole, and here is the South Pole, which they called Terra Australis, you know, the unknown, right? And what's so fun about this is, again, you get all these sea monsters and different creatures and things all over it. It's a heavily decorated map. Yes, there it goes. And so what they're trying to do here is figure out what do we know, right? We know a fair bit now, thanks to Magellan and Drake. We have a fairly good idea what's happening at the bottom of South America. So we're trying to figure out what's going on up here. And they really aren't sure. But this strait is sort of their way of saying, okay, we know that these things aren't connected. Well, eventually, the Tsar of Russia, in a sort of fit of maybe we should answer this question that people keep arguing over and have been arguing over now for a shockingly long period of time, decides to send Bering all the way across Siberia to figure out, hey, is there water over there? Which seems like a rational thing to do, and this is in about 1725. So off he goes. And sure enough, he says, yes, there is water. Now, you would think that this would, much like Magellan's discovery of the Pacific Ocean, instantaneously get him some kind of credit for naming. It absolutely doesn't. Nobody wants to put Bering's name on the Bering Sea. And they don't for a very, very long time. And so the Strait of Annan sticks around. It just now sticks around with a little bit more legitimacy. So this map by Geoffrey Thomas from 1775, you will see where it's marked there in the pink. It still says Strait of Annan. But then in this one, which is from 1757, it's there, but it's left blank. And I think it's interesting to think about this naming thing, right? Because we come back to the importance of naming. In The Power of Maps, Dennis Woods argues that maps are instruments of communication, persuasion, and power. Maps create property lines, they create taxation zones, they indicate a lot of different things, and they embody the interests of their creator, but also the interests of the state. Putting Bering's name on a waterway on a British map would be the equivalent of the British Empire saying, yep, Russia, this is yours. And they are not about to do that. Absolutely not. No way, Jose. They are not going to give that kind of control over to Russia. So they try very hard to keep Bering's name off their maps, and they succeed pretty well, honestly. And this idea of symbolic control is really important, and as we continue to look at these maps, I want everyone to be thinking about what ways in which does mapping these things kind of create this sphere of influence for these various European powers, who are all looking for the Northwest Passage and competing with each other. So, speaking of the Northwest Passage, brings us to Admiral de Fonte. Now, Admiral Bartholomew de Fonte is I think, a really undervalued Spanish explorer. He is just not talked about enough, probably because he didn't exist. So, what is this Northwest Passage that everybody's looking for? What is this thing that they've all decided we are going to spend, incomprehensible amounts of money? I desperately looked through all of my scholarly sources for a price tag on the search for the Northwest Passage, and I could not find it. People spent 2 centuries looking for this thing. The closest I could get was that it would dwarf the space race. British investment alone. So what are they looking for exactly? The line on this map, which is from 1760 in red. So this line is on the map, but it's very hard to see, so I drew over it so everybody could see it. So that is this map's proposal of where the Northwest Passage will run, right? It starts in Spain, because everything starts in Spain in the mid-18th century for exploring. Everything starts in Spain. And then it goes up, you can see, past Canada, through the Great North Sea, which we now think of as the Arctic Ocean, and we know is, well, it was frozen. That's a different issue. And then it comes down. They mention that this was discovered in 1733, and the language there indicates that it is a possible peninsula. So they think there might be land there, but they're not really sure. So they are acknowledging that this map is a bit hypothetical. The other lines on this map that are important that I added are the blue line, which indicates the other very commonly proposed route, which comes out of Baffin Bay, Canada, through up a river of some kind and loops over the top of the poles. And then the last thing I circulated here, which we're going to get to in a minute, is the Sea of the West, which was a hypothetical Western Ocean that was supposed to be an inland ocean, and we'll get into why it matters in a moment. So, who is this de Fonte guy? In 1708, a somewhat minor British periodical that is extremely short-lived, with a great title called Memoirs for the Curious, which, hey, I would read that. That sounds delightful, publishes The Letter of de Fonte, which is a letter from a Spanish admiral. De Fonte, in 1640, leaves Spain. Generally believed that he left Lima, Peru, headed up the west coast of North America, so going through, sort of heading up there, and eventually enters into a series of straits, where he travels across North America through this series of straits, runs into a Boston ship captain named Captain Shapley, and then proceeds to report home, right? Now, at the time, the story had a couple of things going for it. One, everyone knew the Spanish had done the most exploration of North America of anyone. They, in fact, claimed everything that the Pacific Ocean touched was theirs, which is a pretty extreme statement to be making if you stop and think about it. That is a lot of land you are claiming there. But they did. They believed that. The other sort of thing about the Spanish exploration is they never published their own maps or atlases. They were extremely protective of geographic information. So they would have never published this report if this report was true. Because unlike England, who desperately wanted to find a Northwest Passage, unlike France, that was pretty cool with finding a Northwest Passage, Spain was like, we don't want a Northwest Passage, because then you can attack us from the other side, and we don't think that's a good idea. They were not in favor of the rest of Europe finding the Northwest Passage. I mean, if they had found it, that would have been okay, but they were not cool with the rest of Europe finding it. So when they deny the De Fonte story, which they do actively and repeatedly, everyone goes, well, of course you're denying it. You would deny it if it were true. And so nobody believes them. So the Spain are sort of in this tough situation, right? Well, one of the people who absolutely buys in to the great probability of the Northwest Passage is a man named Thomas Jeffries. And Thomas Jeffries is one of my favorite map makers of this era because he makes maps that support every single theory under the sun. If there is a theory under the sun about what the Northwest Coast looks like, Jeffrey has stuck his name on it. He was the royal geographer for the king. So he had a huge amount of authority. So when he spoke, people listened. And this is a copy of his 1768 book in which he makes an ardent defense of the Admiral de Fonte letter. He reprints the entire letter and annotates it, adding all sorts of other evidence that he says points to de Fonte's tale being true. This map has not been digitized. We have not digitized this particular map, but I do have digitized, which we can pass around, a French version of it. This is the same map, it just happens to be in French. So there are a few things that I love. I mean, I know you're not supposed to have favorite children when you curate a collection like this, but it very well may be possible that this is my favorite map of the Pacific Northwest for a slew of reasons. Let us start with the nation of the dwarves, which is at the very top of this map, right up here, under the Tertiary Sea, which was another word for the Northern Sea, the nation of the dwarves. And the belief in the nation of the dwarves, which is this delightful idea, actually comes all the way back from those Magellan maps, where he argued that the North Pole was populated by pygmies. So there you have it. The other thing I love about this map is it talks about indicated by the Japanese. It's very common when people want to make a claim about something, and this is still true today, by the way, when I teach mis and disinformation to my students, I talk about this. The first thing you do is make it come from an exotic source. De Fonte is believable because it's Spanish. And, well, you know the Spanish. And this is believable because it's Japan. It came from Japan. And Japan is about as exotic as you can get to people in 1768, right? So they're all kind of buying into this mythic idea. And so this is one of the many reasons that I just really love this Jeffries map in all of its wildness. What I want you to notice about it is that there is a Bering Strait on it. So he gets that right. He's got that. He's got the Bering Strait. So Bering finally gets his name on that, so good for him. And he actually fairly accurately renders out all these islands. Not completely, right, but he's trying. It's when we get down into here, into all these weird passageways, right? And all of that is part of this De Fonte story, right? That he somehow is going to go up the Strait of Juan de Fuca and enter into these passageways. And some of the people who really, and people really do buy into this idea, right? And one of the things that supports it is this French theory called the Sea of the West. So French geographers start to propose that up the Strait of Juan de Fuca, if Juan de Fuca was real, which is a whole different story, but up the Strait of Juan de Fuca, there might be a sea. And then there could be rivers leading out of that sea, which would get you to the Northwest Passage. And so on a lot of these maps, you will see these big inland seas, and I circled this one in green so we can sort of see it. I maybe should have chosen a different color. There we go. But this is also a map from 1760, so this is right around the same time as that Jeffries map. It's worth noting that there was never any actual justification or evidence for the Sea of the West. Why and how they came up with this idea, I no one quite knows. It just sort of appears one day, and then everyone kind of goes, yeah, that makes sense. Sure, we'll go with that. It's very popular among the French for some reason. And here's another one, also French, from 1762. And once again, we have this big Sea of the West. Other fun elements are we have the Aleutian Islands as one giant island right there. And once again, we have this little archipelago of islands that sort of leads up into these passageways, right? And you have to think about how much money people are spending looking for this Northwest Passage, right? So they really have a vested interest in it being true, right? They don't want to admit, right? And this map's distortion actually kind of increases as more new information is discovered, because then these people have to figure out how do we work it into what we already believe to be true. And so the maps almost get wilder the more people start mapping the actual Northwest coast and information starts coming out. Because now they have to sort of reconcile this new information with their kind of pre-existing beliefs about the system, right? It's a really radical and interesting time in mapping. And it doesn't get disproven until the 1770s. So it takes a while. This is only a few years before we're gonna come around against this. And by the 1770s, Russian fur traders who have been trading along the Aleutian chain, I hesitate to use the word trading. There was a lot of forced labor involved. It was really abusive of the indigenous people. Like, yeah, it has problems. Of course, the Russians were really abusive to their own people too, so we sort of end up in this interesting quagmire of Russian behavior there. But by the 1770s, Russian fur traders have brought back way more information. Oh, whoops. How about this one? Yeah, sorry. Okay. I forgot this slide. Anyway, so this is another one where we have the Sea of the West. And the other thing I want to point out here, well, a couple things on this map that are really fun. One is St. Lawrence Island is really weird looking. That's St. Lawrence Island, in case anyone's wondering. For those of you who are not aware, St. Lawrence Island is 90 miles long and 20 miles wide. So it is not shaped like that. But the one thing on this map that is really, really valuable is right here. This is Gamaland. We don't have a lot of maps that have a really good illustration of Gamaland. Gamaland was another one of these proposed locations. It was a Portuguese trader with China who wrote a book claiming that there were these 3 large islands right off the coast of Kamchatka, and they became known as Gamaland. And so Gamaland shows up on all sorts of maps. What people generally believe now is he mistaked the Kuril Islands, which are lots of tiny islands that are close together, for one landmass. And common things happened with St. Lawrence's Island. Because it is so long and skinny, and the fog is so intense, people would often think it was multiple islands, right? So you'll see a lot of that as well. But yeah, this one's fun. But yeah, it's really interesting to me how these maps, they kind of go from like, okay, this is sort of irrational, and then the more information they find, the more they're trying to include. But they don't want to contradict the stuff they already believe. And so they become this sort of war, right, between what is documented and what is not documented, and what people think is true and what people don't think is true, plus the massive financial reward that would exist if the Northwest Passage was real. But eventually, they send Captain Cook. So the British decide to send Captain Cook up to look for the Northwest Passage in 1776. And this brings us to possibly my favorite map of Alaska ever produced. Again, you're not supposed to have favorites, but I do have one. And it is produced by Jacob, I've got to look at my notes to get this name right, Jacob von Stalin, who is a German, but he is living in Russia. And he produces a map that, I want to be very clear, annoys the crud out of Captain Cook. So this is a French version of this map from 1773. Stalin is a musician. He is an artist. He is the secretary of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He is a tutor to the heir to the throne of Russia, and he is asked to map the North Pacific based on all of the Russian imperial information. And so, armed with truly the best data that anyone really has about what is in the North Pacific and reports from traders, he produces this. Alaska is an archipelago. And this is a big hit, right? In his defense, he was mostly talking to traders, and they mostly are working up and down the Aleutian chain, right? So, and that's a lot of islands, you know. They know there's a mainland out there somewhere, and they call it Alaska, so you can see it right here. There's Alaska right there. Right there it is. That's where we are right now. Yep. So it gets reprinted in English, and then it becomes another one of these runaway hits, right? Because everyone knows the Russians know the most about the North Pacific, people immediately latch onto this map. This version of it appears in London Magazine, which was a very popular, think of it as Newsweek of its era. I realize sometimes when I teach students, I talk about print magazines, they all just look at me with glazed expressions, like, what are you talking about, right? But you know what I mean, right? Like, this is a mass media production object. And people followed this mapping of the North Pacific kind of like we followed the space race in the 60s, right? These London magazines, both this magazine, Gentleman magazine, all these magazines are publishing these maps really regularly. And people are fascinated, right, with what is out there. And if someone finds the Northwest Passage, what incredible wealth they're going to get out of it. I don't even think it's possible to wrap our heads around how much this would have changed the world. In a universe before the Panama Canal and before the Suez Canal, it took a really, really long time to get to Asia if you are starting in Europe. There is no fast way to do that. And if you could go up over the top of the world, just like we do with airplanes now, you could cut that trip down massively. So Cook and Clark, the two captains, go off on their search for the Northwest Passage, armed with the latest Russian maps, right? They've got this map, and they're like, we are gonna go, and we are gonna figure out what's really going on in the North Pacific. And they head over there, and they waste weeks trying to find this strait between Alaska, the Big Island, and North America. And it becomes very clear to them that it is absolutely not there. This does not exist. And Cook actually writes in his journal this really wonderful quote. He says, "Indeed, it is a map to which the most illiterate of his illiterate seafaring countrymen would have been ashamed to set his name." Because as I said in the beginning, you know, Stalin was not a naval officer. He was not a fur trader. He was an artist and musician. So how he was interpreting this information was shaped by someone who really hadn't seen the landscape that he was so eagerly trying to describe. One of the other lovely things about this map is you can see this really beautiful example of a cartouche right down here that I was talking about before. And it has this little decorative swigglies all around it, which I love. One of the other funny things about this map is this map was engraved by Thomas Bowen. And Thomas Bowen's name appears on tons of maps for magazines of this era. He was, I think, just a very popular engraver. And what I love about this is it means he was seeing all of the different versions. And I just can't help but wonder if he just concluded that these people really had no idea what they were talking about. Sometime around version 7 of this thing, he was like, I'm starting to have real concerns about these guys. In case you're wondering, this is the silhouette that we saw on our first slide. So, we're still in sort of this weird land, right? Where things are hypothetical. But Stalin's map is interesting because it does not stick around for very long. Because in 1784, after Cook has died in Hawaii, but his voyage has returned to England, the British Navy, wrong country, does something absolutely unheard of at the time. They publish his voyages in a massive 3-volume set with a huge atlas. And it's a really expensive book, and it sells out immediately. And then they print it again, and then they print it again, and then they print it again. Because the British have figured something out. If they map something, and they name it, and they publish about it, the rest of Europe knows, hey, we've been there. Hey, don't we have a right to that? We've documented it. And so this discovery absolutely radically changes the way people start publishing maps. And all of a sudden, this information that was treated like this top secret state thing starts being produced. And the British do it with almost all their voyages. They do it with Vancouver as well. Then the French do it with Troyes. And all of these things start coming out, right, that are much more detailed mapping. And the maps just get better and better and better. And by 1800, pretty much Alaska looks the way we all know Alaska is supposed to look, with a few exceptions like the St. Lawrence Island, which they can never quite seem to wrap their heads around how many islands are there. I was actually working with some students from St. Lawrence last week, and they had a real hoot out of all of the badly drawn St. Lawrence Islands. They thought it was really fun. Yeah, the Europeans had a real long time trying to figure that one out. But this is Cook's map that comes out in his big atlas. And finally, Alaska looks the way it's, mostly. The other interesting thing about this map you'll notice, and it's very different from most of the other maps we looked at, is there are just these empty parts, right? And that was a way of indicating we don't know what's there, right? So rather than try to invent something, rather than try to make up a coastline, rather than put a sea there and be like, yeah, we think it's a sea, we're going to publish a map in which we don't make any of these wild claims. We're just going to say, this is what we saw, this is the coast as we think it exists. Now, you better believe this doesn't contain everything, right? The British naval documentation was considerably better than the documentation on this map. But it was a start, right? And I think one of the things to think about mapping is, in many ways, mapping isn't really documentation. It can't be, because literal documentation of space is impossible. To truly document a space, you have to be standing in it. We can't reproduce the experience genuinely. So every map, regardless of who makes it or why they make it, is an act of selection. You're deciding what to show. One of the things that is admitted from most of these maps is any of the Alaska Native people, right? These maps present a landscape that is largely devoid of population, even though we very well know the Russians were trading with someone, right? And we know there were people in these places. And we know that they knew there were people. I mean, not early on, but eventually they did figure it out. And they did conclude they were not, in fact, dwarfs. There was some debate there at the beginning. I think one way to think about maps is that selection is purposeful. It's a purposeful construction of a legible object for a viewer. It's an act which loops back to that four-part lens we talked about of how do we understand what are these maps proposing? What are they presenting? What are they offering to a viewer and a viewer's comprehension? I also want to bring us around to this idea of symbolic possession, which, although doesn't really get started until the late 18th century, it sort of lingers in the through the 16th to the 18th century, which is that naming and drawing a place is how European powers asserted claim, often long before or entirely without physically controlling it. Even the Russians never physically controlled most of Alaska, right? But they're on all the maps, right? So they are obviously the owners of the land. It's not just guessing badly. I think when we look at these maps, particularly the maps that are very strange, there is a temptation to fall into the trap of believing, oh, well, they're just guessing badly. And I don't think they are. I think the assumptions they're making are logical based on a set of evidence that is flawed, right? map makers are copying other maps. And if other maps have flaws, those flaws just get reproduced down the line. And then new information comes in, and they have to think about how to reconcile all of these things. I think it's telling when we think about the importance of maps and the reasons we preserve them, even when they are deeply flawed, to realize that the first thing the United States did upon taking possession of Alaska was survey it. They hired someone to do a coast survey, George Davidson, right? And not long after this 816, oh, pardon me, I'm so used to us being in the 16th century. This 1868 map is published. It's Colton's map of the territory of Alaska, ceded by the Russians to the United States. Right? And this comes out right after that treaty is signed. So we have a new possessor, and we know they possess this land because their name is on it. And that is, I think, the reason we really hold these maps and we keep them. Even though I will openly acknowledge some of them are a little strange. little weird. But I know that because I'm a person living now. And I certainly wouldn't have necessarily known it were I living in 1612. I have been told that there is a survey that I am supposed to encourage you all to take from summer sessions, but I would also love to take questions if there are any. I know we went through a lot of information very quickly. Yes?
In your archives, do you have the upside-down map, the one that has Australia? Oh. Okay. In the archives, do you have the upside-down map? You know, the one with Australia at the top and everything else at the bottom?
I'm trying to think. So we have 1,250 maps.
Yeah.
So I will openly admit I have not seen every single one of them. That is not familiar to me. We do have a Japanese map where Japan is the middle of the earth. Yeah. And yes, in that map, I am pretty sure it is upside down, now that I think about it.
Does the general public have access to that?
Absolutely. So all of our collections are open to the public.
Okay.
We just ask that you make an appointment with our archives, okay, which is open 10 to noon, 1 to 4, Mondays through Fridays, okay, and then we can physically pull them for you. All of our flat maps, so not our maps in books, have been, well, I shouldn't say all, because if I say all, it'll turn out there's one that's not, and I'll get in trouble. Most of them have been digitized and are available through links in our library catalog. So if you find a map in the catalog, you'll see a little link. You can click on the link, and then it will pull you a beautiful high-resolution digital. And we are working on getting them all photographed. But as you can imagine, that is an ongoing project for our part-time digitization staff.
Very cool.
Yeah.
It struck me, a brief question is,
Oh, please.
I've always imagined that Cook, not necessarily Cook, but his shipmates or whatever, did a pretty good job of mapping. Maybe that's not true. What your thoughts were in terms of whether that was, you know, the result, whether he did it or whether he had someone that was doing a good job. Yeah.
As I understand it, there was a surveyor on board.
Yes.
So there always were people there who it was their job to mark all of these things. I think we do give sort of the head of the voyage credit for everything the voyage did. I mean, we call it Magellan's Voyage, even though he dies. We sort of do that. So Cook gets credit. The best maps the British produce are the ones produced by Vancouver. The Vancouver maps, I have been told, and I am not a good enough sailor to be confident in this statement, but I've been told by people who are that you could navigate Southeast Alaska with the Vancouver maps. You wouldn't want to. They're, you know, from 1799, I think, so they're a trifle out of date. But you could if you had to. So Vancouver's maps are really the maps that are known for being the best that are produced by the British. And then, of course, the Russians start producing atlases and maps of their own. And those are getting into wide circulation as well. So, yeah. Yes? Oh.
Yeah, the Russians should be recognized for really good documentation going into the 1830s, 1820s to 1840s with the Wrangell map that came out in 1839, and I've analyzed the eastern portion of it exhaustively, but it's primary documentation of the name place names, and even the span, it's all below latitude. The Yukon River is not on it in 1839, but it's really amazing. The language, the realicitation of place names is part of the argument that those names are very ancient and they're rule-driven, and there's cognates now with the Siberian language on the NSA, the Yeniseian languages, and even on the Wrangell map, you take the name for where Katie John's village was on Tenada Creek. It's Natat, Cat, and Otna, and on Wrangell, in the Wrangell map, it's Nutatkak, and you can tell that the Dena'ina speaker is saying it not in the name, and that's true for Toklat too. They have Toklat spelled T-Toot, whereas locally here they would say Toot-Tot. So there's a Dena'ina speaker in Cook Edward saying that, and I argued that the names are rule-driven and placed there as permanent names when they're initially occupying the area.
Oh, yeah. The Russians, do a lot of mapping of Alaska. Once they have a permanent, once they invade in 1784, I like to call it an invasion because they show up with gunships. I think that's an invasion. And they permanently occupy Kodiak, what we now call Kodiak. It takes them a few years to kind of get themselves sorted, but they do start going up the rivers. As the fur runs out, they begin going up the rivers and looking for these additional kind of locations. And they're looking for fur, is really what they're looking for.
Another big name is Voisin.
Yes, yes, yep.
Voisinski's map of 1842. The key
Yep, it's a beautiful one as well.
annotated that, and it's beautiful.
It is.
Apparently, the copper plates of that are in Mount St. Petersburg.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that. I will have to.
Tom at the mining museum.
Oh, I will have to go. I will have to go on a pilgrimage next time I'm in Petersburg. That would be lovely.
Bunsen. He's the
Yeah.
those names.
Thank you. Dr. Akari here has forgotten more, I am sure, about Alaska place naming than I will ever know. So thank you.
Go ahead. All right.
Dr. Richard Pierce, the foremost Russian American historian, he and I discussed a Russian community that was established 100 years before white discovery, and other Russian ships came down the Elmer River. 2 of them made it back. And the Russians tried to find the survivors and gave up. And Pierce published like 17 books, limestone press. He has no press. So one question I have is are we to the point yet with AI to compare your maps to written accounts that fill in the gaps, and you don't have a map of that community because the Russians never found it. They gave up on it. But like in the 70s, I talked to Michael Brown, who created I think it was him. They paid the students from the university to read 600 books on Alaska. And anytime it mentioned a river body or lake or whatever, they said, this page, this book. That's an example. That would coordinate very well with the maps. Because, and I asked him in the 70s, I said, can I get a copy of this? It only existed in terrible microfiche. And he said, why? I said, it's the best index I know, the water bodies in Alaska. So that, and incidentally, I don't think, the only thing I could find printed out was the original dot matrix, which I had to fill in from the 70s. But that would coordinate very well with the map library. Another question, I need to give this up. Do you have any maps of Felix Pedro's claims, the early mining claims?
That is a really good question that I do not know off the top of my head. But I can give you a card and I would encourage you to email me.
Give me what?
Give me a card, and I can look it up for you. I can give you one of my business cards.
Okay.
Because that's just not something that I know. I have not gone looking. And if we did, they would probably be in the archives, because that's usually where our mining claim documentation lives. Other thing I would say is that generally mining claims were territorial records, and those ended up down at the state archives, not with us, because they were the state archives in Juneau, because mining claims were part of the property transfers. And so those were going through the court system.
I'll send you the question.
But please send it to me, and we'll see what we can find.
Thank you.
Great, I think we have time for one last question. I'll just mention in response to this, I am a pack rat of books and lived in Anchorage when the MLIS library was getting rid of all kinds of collections. USGS office closed, and I have some mining, just maps of USGS is another big source.
Yeah.
Maps for mining claims, way back more. I was just, I'll preface my comment that my focus has been the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and I spent decades creating series of maps to counter, here's northern Alaska. See that little square red dot? That's the 2,000 acres they want to develop in the coastal plain of the refuge. The Interior Department, when they had the lease sale this time, they did not say it was the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge coastal plain anywhere on the leasing map. And so truth and accuracy in maps and how maps are used to skew, present a perspective, I think you've done a good historical role here, and maybe there's some modern applications. I'll just make that suggestion.
I think you are absolutely right. I do not think that any of this has changed. Maps are selective documents. They're presenting the world in a very specific way. And the way that we present the world is then the way we understand it. And how we name things, what we call them, whether we call it Utiavik or we call it Barrow, that says something about what we believe about the space, and who has a right to name the space and who has the right to claim the space. So yeah, maps, none of this has changed. These examples are fun because we know what Alaska is supposed to look like. And so I think it's interesting to see it distorted in these interesting ways. But if there is a serious aspect to this talk, it is that I think you are absolutely right, that this is absolutely still happening, and it probably always will, as long as people are making maps.
Well, there's Jared Smith and I have this an atlas of dead name place names, and it has something like 13,000 name features, and many of them have multilingual variants, like Toklak or something, and so, but all the features are points. It's arbitrarily points when they're not really just points. And
Absolutely.
So they are linear features and areas in the native language. And our map is not affiliated with the university, and it has open access. And I'm getting concerned about that with some of these AI searches about glacial Lake Ottman, because we've got intense documentation in glacial Lake Ottman Basin, and it's just crazy what AI can do with the stuff they've taken from our web map. We're going to have to create a formal licensing thing. I think in the ANC of the future, which I'm arguing is robust, that could be within an ethnogeography and applied toponymy too would be interesting fields that we could.
Absolutely, yeah. Modern GIS is really fascinating, and the ability of mapping to happen today. I just got back from a conference, a polar conference. Some of the people there were mappers of Antarctica, and it was absolutely fascinating and absolutely above my head. mean, this is satellite AI improved recognition of features. It's really wild what you can do nowadays. It gives me a lot of, I think, love still for these old efforts, which are creative and I think very charming.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel.
Well, thank you.
That concludes our lecture.
Wonderful.